and I think you've probably all got the same message, that the meeting will be recorded. I think the speakers are the only people that are going to be recorded, so don't worry, when it comes to the discussion, the recording will be switched off. But welcome to tonight's meeting. So as I say, we're here in the start of a series of meetings looking at individual chapters of the recently published report, which is entitled Climate Jobs, Building Workforce for the Climate Emergency. There will be plenty of time for discussion this evening. Tonight's meeting is to focus particularly on the chapter on energy, which is entitled Keeping the Lights On with Renewables, Climate Jobs in Energy. My name is Suzanne Jeffrey. I'm the editor of the report and also chair the trade union group of the Campaign Against Climate Change. I'm going to shortly introduce the speakers for tonight's meeting. Just to say a couple of words, the report itself has updated the 1 Million Climate Jobs report. By doing that, we have felt it important to look at a bigger framing. So when we talk about a transition, a just transition, we are talking about a transformation of the economy. Within, and therefore the book looks at a range of different sectors of the economy, from energy to buildings to waste to agriculture to nature, etc. And transport, of course. But energy obviously is a really crucial part, and around the question of energy, some of the other chapters hang in terms of what kind of energy system do we need, what type of ownership do we need over that energy system, how much energy do we really need to use to make this transition, to meet targets which will keep us below 1.5 degrees warming, and to do it in the framing of climate justice, where we accept our responsibility, that differentiated responsibility as one of the wealthier parts of the world, with a much longer responsibility for the emissions that are currently in the atmosphere. The report itself more broadly identifies many jobs could be created if this transition could and should take place. The report more broadly identifies public ownership as absolutely crucial, and that the market has failed. And I think, just before I hand over to our speakers, I think on that question of that market has failed, I think we're, on the question of energy, we are seeing the failure of the market as we speak in the cost of living crisis. So we're seeing a failure of the market, not only to deliver the kind of energy which allows us to protect the environment, to have a livable planet, but we're also seeing a market failure just in terms of being able to deliver affordable energy for people. And it's worth reminding ourselves, before we begin this discussion, that the current energy system that we have at this moment in time also includes one that has been really pushed in the last 10, 15 years by the governments that have been in power in the last 15 years, when they had the opportunity to move and invest towards renewable energy. That direction was absolutely consciously rejected. Instead, we had the dash for gas that took place under the coalition government and then Cameron Osborne's government. And is that dash for gas and a further dash for fracking, which fortunately the movement pushed them back on, that has delivered us into this place where we're not making the emissions reductions that we need to, and we are not able to deliver affordable energy for the majority of people, whilst meanwhile a tiny section of society get extremely wealthy on the back of a failed energy system and a failed market model. So our report really argues in a very different direction, and a need for utter urgency to deliver these transformations. Tonight's panel include Alan Robottom, who's the lead author on the chapter in this report on energy, also a co-author of the chapter on buildings, and that's the next session in this session of meetings. We also have Sam Mason, who I'll introduce before she speaks. Sam will speak on the question of nuclear power, which has been, as people will know, pushed as a key strategy of this government, and one that we've rejected in the report. Also really pleased to have Simon Pirani, who will speak on another so-called solution that's been heavily pushed by this government, which is the question of hydrogen. And then finally, Sally Clark, who again I'll introduce, who will address the question of biofuels, which again forms like a three-pronged strategy, the energy strategy that's been pushed by our current government, building on top of the already existing fossil fuel infrastructure that we have in place at this moment in time. So welcome everybody. It's a really nice turnout. Do feel free to say hello in the chat, but I think that's sufficient from me. And at that stage, I'd like to hand over to Ellen, who will give us that big broad frame of what we've argued for in the report on the question of energy. So Ellen, welcome.
Thanks, Suzanne. So here's the difficult task of galloping through all the positives, really, I think, in our in the energy chapter. So I'm just going to work from these slides. So can everybody see? Can everyone see that?
Yes, we can see, Ellen.
Right. Okay. So the starting point is really, what do our targets need to be? And I think probably most people in this meeting will be aware that the whole idea of net zero by 2050 is pretty farcical. That's for a variety of reasons. There are lots of resources that you can read to clarify this, but basically, as a global target, it only gives us a 50-50 chance of staying within 1.5 degrees. It doesn't take account of the fact that countries like the UK have the biggest amount of historic responsibility for emissions and are also the most wealthy and the most able to actually do something about it. It also gives us, even on a purely per capita basis, it gives the UK too big a share of the remaining carbon budget, which is the amount that we can still put into the atmosphere before passing that threshold. The other farcical part of it is the net part, of course, the net part of net zero, meaning that we're depending on unproven or indeed technologies that are known to be ineffective, but are certainly unproven at this stage, that are supposed to be available in the future, and are therefore enabling fossil fuel companies to continue business as usual and potentially locking in dependence on gas and oil. And then there's also the inclusion of these so-called market solutions, such as carbon trading and offsetting. So the conclusion there is that we need to go much faster, of course. How do we do that? Obviously, end the extraction and burning of fossil fuels. Now, then we get onto the bits, the number crunching bits. I'm not going to throw numbers at you here, but it's all in the booklet, and where it's not in the booklet itself, it's in the technical companions, which you can read online. But what the conclusion that we came to was that in order to end fossil fuels and decarbonise the energy system, that we need to roughly double the amount of electricity that we're generating, and also roughly half the amount of energy that we use overall. And this is really important, because that really gives us the framing for the remainder of the booklet. The bulk of the remaining chapters are really addressing that question about how we reduce our energy consumption, and in ways that are socially useful and equitable. Of course, that electricity needs to be produced only through genuine renewables technologies that can be available within a relevant timescale, because we know that the emissions cuts that we make now are of far more value than any that we make in the last few years, as we're approaching this supposed deadline. So we're looking at wind, solar and water technologies. And I've also added geothermal, although that's not really discussed in the chapter, but that is one of the options in many locations. We need to accelerate research and implementation of safe energy storage, because we're going to have a more intermittent supply, and also we're going to have to take account of peaks and troughs in demand. So it's complicated, and safe storage options are really key here. We need to hugely expand and train or retrain the workforce. So some of the workers here will be new entrants to the labour market. Some will be unemployed people that are seeking employment, and some will be, of course, transitioning from either into different jobs if they're working in high carbon sectors, or having to learn new skills as their own sectors move to low carbon approaches. And then key to the remainder of the book, and as Suzanne's just mentioned, that we do need to bring the energy system into public ownership, within which the core employment model will be direct public employment within what we're calling a national climate service. So on a similar model to the National Health Service, there's a similar kind of thing, that people are directly employed, but it has many parts to it, and it's a means of integrating all the different aspects that have to be taken into account. So what can a National Climate Service do that the existing market-dependent situation cannot do? So we need to get rid of the distortions and the blocks that the market and the vested interest, the corporate lobbyists bring to the transition pathway. We need to have the technologies that are the most efficient ways of rapidly reducing carbon emissions and of course other greenhouse gas emissions, that we need to be selecting them purely on the basis of how effective they are, and also about what the implications are for things like resource use and other potential damages to the environment that are caused by resource extraction. So there are some really important technologies that at the moment are struggling to get past the research and development stage, but are actually going to be a really important part of the mix. And these technologies need more investment at this moment, and they include tidal stream turbines and wave energy. There may well be others. We can ensure a fair transition of workers. So the vast majority of workers, according to the surveys, are aware of the need to transition into low emissions work or low emissions technologies, and they want to do it, and they want to be trained to do it. But we need to be able to create the mechanisms that make that possible. We can create millions of decent, secure, unionised jobs. At least 500,000 of them can be in energy generation, distribution and storage, but many, many more will be in the other sectors that we're going to talk about. We can ensure equitable access to affordable energy. As Suzanne's just touched on, we're seeing a crisis of affordability of energy at the moment, but also even before this, we've got an issue with the way that the kind of approach that the government has taken to so-called greening of the sector and greening of the domestic sector as well. This sort of policies of paying subsidies to private homeowners who can already afford to retrofit their homes, to install renewables, etc. But they're being subsidised through a variety of different grants and feed-in tariffs and in the past, and obviously they're not efficient. They're badly targeted, and above all, they're really inequitable. They're focusing essentially on the able to pay private market. So we need a lot more support for supply chain industries, because this is often left out of account. People are looking at the sort of finished product, the wind turbines, the solar farms or whatever, but not about all the supporting industries that lie behind that are not getting the support and the investment. And also huge number of jobs need to be created in new sectors that will be to do with recycling materials. And then just overall, enabling a democratic and integrated planning of what will be a very, very complex system involving centralised and distributed generation and storage, transmission, distribution, load spreading technologies, so many different things that all need to be integrated, and it's complex. And we don't want to do it in a way that just turns as the plan is at the moment, to turn everything into a so-called prosumer that's just creating their own little bit of the system, and it's all creating a huge headache for planning and integration. And I've just put the NB there because this is very important, that homes and buildings are actually really, in a sense, are part of the energy system, because they're absolutely key to our ability to, first of all, to cut demand, but also to have efficient spreading of the energy demand, load spreading. And this is something that the National Climate Service needs to support through a programme of retrofit as public works, not again as this kind of hodgepodge of private work. So that will be the subject of next week's. I'm pretty much out of time, but I'm just going to really just quickly run through a few of the reasons why we're very adamant that we can't just go on building more and more and more renewables in order to continue with business as usual, because clearly all technologies make huge demands on resources. All technologies have emissions associated with them, although a lot of those will fall as more and more of the energy system becomes decarbonised. But these are not arguments against the technologies, but they are saying that we need to be very clear that there are limits to how much energy we can produce and use. So, for example, things like, people have probably read about the atrocious labour conditions in things like cobalt mining in the Democratic Republic of Congo. There's problems with extraction of lithium, nickel, copper, all kinds of minerals, some common, some not so common, but all causing quite a bit of environmental devastation, as well as abuse of the labour force. Environmental impacts of silicon mining, lots of toxic waste is being leaked into the environment. A lot of this is an issue of more regulation needed, and also, of course, very much more organisation of workers in those sectors, and just the sheer scale of the resources that are needed. It is you can read yourself, but I've just given random examples really, and then the fact that it takes up space. Wind farms, solar farms, etc. They take up space, which is needed for so many other things. So I'm just finishing on the conclusions here. So no unlimited renewables. We must prioritise reducing energy demand, but through socially beneficial and equitable means, which we will be talking about in our future meetings. Prioritise reduction, reuse and recycling of materials and components, and researching safer technologies for some of these batteries, turbines, solar cells and so on. So for the technologies that we've criticised and taken a stand against, I will pass on to our other speakers, and I'll leave it there for now. Thank you.
Sorry, thanks, Ellen, and welcome to those who have joined. Ellen's quite right. We will now move to take some shorter contributions from some of our other speakers about the technologies that we have rejected in this report. Just one thing before I introduce Sam. Thanks, Helen, for your question in the chat. Do feel free to put questions in the chat. We'll take the final speakers. There'll be time to then take in audience participation with questions or points, as well as whatever people feel they want to add to the chat as well, and our speakers will be able to come back on some of those questions. So I'm going to hand over now to Sam Mason. Sam is the PCS Policy Officer for Sustainability and Climate. Sam also contributed a section on nuclear power and why in this report we've rejected that. So Sam, welcome, and I'll hand over to you.
Great, thanks, Suzanne, and thanks to you all for the opportunity to contribute in this meeting about nuclear power, because it's also an issue quite close to my heart as an active anti-nuclear campaigner. Yeah, I just thought I'd start. I mean, obviously the nuclear question is a tricky one because it's not black and white like fossil fuels. I know that there are environmentalists that are looking at nuclear power as the option that unfortunately we have to go down because of the time frame that we've got left to deal with the climate challenge and decarbonisation. Obviously we're split in the trade union movement around this, and clearly there's large lobbies of politicians and corporations that are pushing around nuclear as well. But I just want to set out, and probably for many people here, the major disadvantages to nuclear power: lack of long-term strategy of dealing with the highly toxic nuclear waste, uncertainty over cost of new nuclear stations and the risk to taxpayers be left to pick up the cost, danger that going down the nuclear route would lock us into constant centralized systems of distributing energy. Risks of the nuclear program would undermine efforts to improve energy efficiency, the threats obviously from terrorism, things like this, but of course also threats from climate change itself. And also that it distracts from going into renewable energy. Now, that's not actually me saying that. That was the Sustainable Development Commission saying that in 2006, which was, some of you may recall, was the government body that was set up to look at these things. And this was in the last Labour government, and it was very soon abolished within the coalition government. But at that moment in time, although Tony Blair did want to take on nuclear power, it was felt very clear that nuclear was not the way that we should be going. And all those reasons that were set out there over 14, 16 years ago actually remain. And, we know that these things now clearly do exist, particularly around costs and things like this. And I think that's one of the points about the industry, because we kind of get told that we don't understand it. There's new nuclear that we should be looking at, but nuclear has been around for a very, very long time. There is nothing to misunderstand about this industry. We have got lots of evidence about cost overruns, what the issues we're facing now on the European pressurized reactors, which they're building in France and Finland and Hinkley and proposed for Sizewell C. They've got design flaws in those, which is setting them back. They're all overrunning both on time and on cost. But fundamentally, we don't have time to go down the nuclear route, but we also don't have time to have our energy system held up by this constant debate around nuclear, because we'll literally be designing a whole energy system that's focused on one energy source that will actually won't be providing the bulk of our energy. And in some of the scenarios will only be providing around 5%, I think it is, of the energy. And so this whole idea that we need this base load of power that's tied to nuclear, which is not flexible, where there are outages, there's planned outages to shut down and obviously do maintenance work on nuclear plants. We need to just dispel these myths and move on to the proper energy transition that we need. And the discussion now as well, we have to understand and learn and be on board with the technologies, because what's being promoted around small modular reactors, again, this is a technology which has been around for some time. It's something that the government's investing in and supporting Rolls-Royce because they want to make it a competitive industry and bring it to market. So a lot of this is based on what Ellen was laying out around this notion of the private sector in our energy system. It's not actually being driven by the means and the tasks that we have around decarbonisation. And the other important thing around that is, of course, we are cross-subsidising the defence programme with our civilian nuclear programme. That's not a secret. It's in government documents. Rolls-Royce say within their nice glossy brochure for SMRs that this technology will support, obviously, in the defence sector as well. And I think, I know I haven't got long to make a contribution here, but I think we have to be clear as well around jobs, because obviously trade unions quite rightly want to talk about jobs in the nuclear sector, highly paid, good skilled jobs. Yes, they are. But if you look at the majority of the jobs, they're in the construction side, they're in the building trades. So the pipe fitters, the welders, the electricians will all still be needed in other roles to decarbonise the economy. Those jobs won't go away. Of course, there will be some specialised jobs around, nuclear engineering and technicians, etc. But there's such a huge legacy cost of the current nuclear industry. Work will still be there, and we see that in Scotland at the moment with the plant that's just been closed down. I know some of those people are not staying on, but we're there to defuel the plant, and obviously you've got the whole decommissioning around that and all the waste management and everything that goes with it as well. But also with SMRs, and I just find it astonishing that trade unions are arguing for these, it's about modular construction. This is going to be manufactured within plants, not on site. And of course, one of the whole arguments around that is cost reduction to make it competitive, that's what I'm looking for, competitive with renewable technology to bring the prices down. And we all know if they want to bring the prices down, it's labour that they attack, and that's where it will go. So I think I'll just leave it there, because I'm sure there'll be questions and lots of debate around this and the other technologies as well. Thanks.
Sam, thanks for that, and thanks for doing such a succinct job in such a short space of time. So thanks so much for that, Sam. To remind people, we will take questions, and please use the chat function to address any questions as well to the speakers. I'm going to move on now to Simon Pirani. Simon is the author of Burning Up, A History of Fossil Fuel Consumption, and is an energy campaigner over many years. Simon has a very difficult job now of covering a really large topic, and a complex topic, or it certainly has been presented to us as a complex topic, on the question of hydrogen, carbon capture and storage. And I'm going to hand it over to you, Simon, to do that. Simon, you asked for a 1 minute notification. Are you okay for me to jump in and give you that?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, that's fine. Thanks, Suzanne. Okay. Hello, everybody. Thanks very much for inviting me. Just a quick caveat. I'm not a chemist and I'm not an engineer. And my work, I've done a lot of research on energy systems, starting from the social dynamics, the history, but what I'm going to present is the basics. I've also put it on slides. I'll share those and I'll send those to Ellen and Suzanne afterwards, because I've got one slide at the end with some links, stuff to read, including stuff by people who really are chemists and engineers and know a lot about some of the details than I do. Is that sharing?
It is, yes.
Right. I was going to try and get back to the beginning. Sorry, I'm not the most technical person. Never mind. So capitalism does have climate policies. It has policies around so-called green growth, and it has techno fixes. And hydrogen is a classic techno fix, which plays a huge part in this government strategy. We shouldn't call it a strategy. It's a collection of points that Boris Johnson sucked out of his thumb. There are three types of hydrogen, and the one that matters here probably most is the blue hydrogen, because that's at the center of the big project which is making the running in the UK to turn over a big part of the home heating in the north to away from gas into blue hydrogen. But I think to make sense of this, let's quickly talk about the three colors. The gray hydrogen is what they do now. You take natural gas, you take the hydrogen out, you separate the carbon, and the carbon goes into the atmosphere. Not good. The blue hydrogen is the same, but instead of putting the carbon into the atmosphere, you capture the carbon and store it. Carbon capture and storage. Now that's a technology that oil companies, energy companies have been trying to make work for at least 30 years, and none of them have done so in a way that makes any sense. There are a couple of plants where they use that carbon dioxide and then pump it back into a oil reservoir in order to increase the pressure in the oil reservoir to produce more oil, which from a decarbonisation point of view is not great. So blue hydrogen is supposedly doing what the grey hydrogen does, but capturing and storing the carbon with a method that doesn't work. And the other problem, which has come much more into the understanding of the engineers over the past year or so, is the amount of methane leaks that you get, both from producing the gas and transporting it in the first place, and then from the CCS. And methane is a lot more, it packs a much more powerful punch as a greenhouse gas than carbon does. So problems with that. Green hydrogen is the third one. That's you produce that by electrolyzing water. It's free of greenhouse gas emissions, but it just needs a gigantic amount of electricity. So the question then becomes, would you use that electricity for that or something else? So here's the grey hydrogen as it's used now. Now, all the blue and green hydrogen currently being produced, if you look at that round circle, that tiny green sliver at the top, that's the green and blue hydrogen. All the rest, the 99%, is grey hydrogen from gas, grey hydrogen from coal. The CO2 goes straight into the atmosphere, and then you see on the chart, global aviation, right? That's the that highest bar. That's the emissions from global aviation. Global hydrogen is about 4/5 of that amount. It's a lot of there's a lot of CO2 going into the atmosphere. So if people talk to you about blue hydrogen, ask them why don't we start with capturing and storing the carbon from the hydrogen that's currently being produced. And just a quick note about what it's being used for. The big blue wedge there, that's going to oil refineries. Ammonia production, that's fertilizers, which is more difficult to see how you can do that otherwise. You'd have to start deconstructing industrial agriculture, but God knows, let's hope that in line with what our comrades and friends in peasant movements advocate, that can be done. But you know, that blue wedge is going to oil refineries. Okay, so now on to the blue hydrogen, which is manufactured from natural gas. There's a paper been produced by two academics in the beginning of last year, or middle of last year, Robert Howarth, who's an ecologist who's done a lot of work on methane leaks, and Mark Jacobson, who's one of these kind of high-flying Harvard people who's been churning out these ideas about 100% renewables. He's not too fussed about where the minerals come from, so he's politically probably not in the same place as many of us. But they've done this joint paper, and what it shows is that it slightly depends on what assumptions you use, but blue hydrogen produces a lot of greenhouse gas emissions, especially from the methane leaks. And their kind of central scenario is that you're going to get 20% more greenhouse gas from converting your natural gas into hydrogen than if you just put your natural gas in a power station and burnt it. Okay, 20% more. In other words, it's got a bigger carbon footprint than gas. Now, it's interesting to follow the way that these two were denounced by oil companies, by some other researchers, and so on and so on. But even if you tweak their assumptions as they do in the paper, you can't make blue hydrogen low carbon because of those methane leaks, because of the limitations of the process. That's blue hydrogen. Just a quick word about green hydrogen. And again, partly because we're told that, right, blue hydrogen is paving the way to green hydrogen, and green hydrogen is going to be great. But as I said, because it uses so much energy to do the electrolysis, if you're going to use that renewable electricity to make hydrogen, my first question would be, wouldn't it be better to put it straight into the electricity grid and displace your coal and gas? And this diagram hopefully shows why. So if you got a kilowatt hour of renewables, that replaces 2 kilowatt hours of gas, and that gray blob is the amount of carbon emissions that's associated with that. It replaces 2.5 or 3 kilowatt hours of coal, and it replaces a much bigger blob of greenhouse gas emissions. But if you use it via electrolysis to produce the hydrogen, that orange square down the bottom, you displace a very, very small amount of greenhouse gas emissions indeed. So every time green hydrogen comes up, isn't it better to put it straight into the grid? At this stage, we're not talking about what's going to happen in 20 years' time, 30 years' time, 50 years' time, and so on and so on. We're talking about now. And coming on to now, UK government hydrogen strategy, everything important is vague. So we're told it's going to be a twin track approach, blue hydrogen and green hydrogen, to produce 5 gigawatts of hydrogen production capacity by 2030. The number now is actually minuscule. And money, £240 million is going to go into this net zero hydrogen fund, but that will go basically to oil companies and energy companies. That's where it will go. So it'll be added to all the subsidies that currently the tax system gives to those companies. Now, I haven't...
Simon, 1 minute, if possible.
Yeah, the strategy is, thank you. The strategy is long, and there's a giant pile of documents to support it. I haven't read the whole thing, but the press release that came with it, I mean, this just shows you how seriously they take their own propaganda. The press release said this hydrogen could be powering 3 million UK homes each year. But the text talks about less than 1 terawatt hour of energy for heat by 2030, when they actually get into a bit of detail, and that's enough for 70,000 homes. Not 3 million, 70,000. So that's how, that's a detail that's been applied to actually working out how this is going to work. But of course, the background to that is this huge lobbying effort by the oil companies and by the energy companies to force through some interesting government in this scheme in the north of England, which is to turn over a large part of the gas network to hydrogen, and to use the population of Yorkshire and some of the other parts of the northeast as guinea pigs for this method of heating homes with hydrogen. Now, when I looked at this, and Ellen and the Leeds Trades Council have done fantastic work on this, when I looked at it, I mean, you just find piles of reports by specialists on home heating and so on. They all say heat pumps. They all say retrofit the homes, insulate them. They all say insulate Britain, actually. And those reports have been completely ignored. They've time and time again, things have come up to base, have come up to the government for approval. It's always delay, delay, delay. Now this hydrogen scheme is being fast forwarded. But I mean, I actually think the oil companies may know that it's never going to work, and they just want to tap some more government funds to finance the research stage. I think the Leeds Trades Council, I mean, I know you'll be talking about this anyway, but I mean, I just think the Leeds Trades Council campaign on, let's have retrofit and heat pumps instead of this hydrogen thing is a fantastic example of the way we should be campaigning on these issues, saying, no, we're not just going to take the technologies that the government like. We're the labour movement. We like other technologies. Not that hydrogen won't have some place in the system in the future, but the question is, what about now? What about the climate emergency? What about between now and 2030? And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks, Simon. Thanks very much. And the slides, people have asked for those slides. I know you said you would email them, which is fantastic. I think that what we'll do is we'll get it up on our website alongside the recording of this event. So give us a couple of days and we'll get it up on the website and get the slides up alongside it as well. Just one final point, picking up on what Simon said about the Leeds Trades Council campaign and the campaigns to fight for retrofitting rather than go down the route that Simon has identified. And that's also a theme that we'll pick up next week in our session next week, where we look at the chapter that we produced on buildings, co-authored by Ellen and Wolfgang's the other author, and how important it is that we both understand the significance of retrofitting and launch these campaigns in as many places as possible, kind of following the examples that Simon has mentioned. earlier. Thanks so much. And both Sam and Simon have touched on one factor, which is the huge amounts of money that the government are putting into things that neither urgently address the climate crisis or have within them real solutions to the climate crisis, and send us off in kind of maintaining an infrastructure around fossil fuels, slightly twisted or distorted, rather than moving away from them, which leads me to the next speaker, which is Sally Clark. Sally is the UK Bioenergy campaigner for Biofuels Watch, and Sally will address one of those other areas that the government are putting a lot of money and effort into, which is biofuels, either producing our electricity via stations like Drax, or in the Netherlands, of how can they maintain expanded aviation on the back of new investment in biofuels. So Sally, welcome, and great to have you here, and be lovely to hear what you've got to say on that.
Thank you so much. I'm just going to try sharing my screen. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about another of the techno fixes which is currently being promoted by the government, and it's called Bioenergy with Carbon Capture and Storage, or BECCS. I'm going to say a little bit about what BECCS involves, why we're very concerned about the current promotion of BECCS, and what other alternatives there are for green energy and green jobs. So firstly, what is BECCS? So it stands for Bioenergy with Carbon Capture and Storage, and it basically involves cutting down trees, turning them into small wood pellets, and then burning them in power stations for energy. And then the theory is that you can use chemical solvents to capture the carbon dioxide and then store it either underground or under the sea. And it's being promoted by a lot of companies and by governments, which see it as a climate solution and a way of drawing carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. And at the moment, burning wood for energy is classified as carbon neutral, because it's assumed that when you cut down trees and you burn them, that new trees will grow in the future and absorb the emissions we produce today. And because burning wood for energy is classed as carbon neutral, BECCS would be, in theory, even better. It would be classed as carbon negative, the idea that you can capture even more CO2 than you emit. And there's one company in particular that's claiming it can become the world's first carbon negative power station. And you may have heard of it. It's called Drax Power Station in Selby in Yorkshire. Drax is a coal power station, which is now almost exclusively burning wood. And it's actually the biggest tree burning power station in the entire world. Drax is also the UK's single largest carbon emitter. And in 2020, it emitted over 13 million tonnes of CO2 from burning 7 million tonnes of wood. Almost all of that wood is imported, and the majority comes from clear-felled forests in the southern USA, Canada, Estonia, and Latvia. And these are forests that are global biodiversity hotspots. Drax is now planning to put in an application for BECCS technology in the spring or summer this year. It's also part of a group that wants to have a pipeline into the Humber to store the carbon dioxide. And Drax is asking the government for huge new subsidies for the BECCS technology, on top of the £2 million every single day which Drax currently receives for burning wood. And its current subsidies are paid for through a surcharge on our energy bills. There are some huge problems, however, with BECCS, which Drax is not admitting. And the first one is that BECCS technology exists only as an idea. It's a completely unproven technology. There are no fully functioning BECCS schemes operating anywhere in the world using BECCS from wood burning. There are some schemes working with ethanol fermentation. For example, when you ferment corn, wheat, or sugarcane, it's fairly easy and cheap to capture that CO2, and it's happening in Illinois. However, it's not carbon negative because these refineries are being operated with fossil fuels, and far more CO2 is being emitted from burning the fossil fuels to run the refinery than can be captured. So the only company that's currently proposing to do BECCS from wood burning is Drax in Yorkshire. And so far, Drax has been working with a small startup company called Sea Capture. It was aiming to capture 1 ton of CO2 per day out of the 13 million tons it emitted in 2020. It's now working with a company called Mitsubishi, which is doing some product testing on a new chemical solvent. And so far, Drax has released all of the CO2 back into the atmosphere. There is nothing being stored at all. Drax has no way of storing the CO2 because it needs this big pipeline out into the Humber. And last year, crucially, Drax admitted to environmental campaigners that their BECCS assumptions for energy are not based on trials. So Drax has no real-world evidence that the BECCS technology is working. And in fact, BECCS technology is unlikely ever to work, because as Simon was saying, there have already been a lot of attempts to capture carbon from fossil fuel burning, like burning coal, and they've been largely unsuccessful. And burning wood is very different to burning coal, so you cannot just transfer the knowledge that people have gained from carbon capture research into coal burning. Moreover, it takes a lot of energy to capture and compress the CO2, and you would need to burn about 1/3 more wood just to get the same energy output for the power station. The second huge problem with BECCS technology is that even if the technology were made to work, it would have a devastating impact on forests, wildlife, communities, and the climate. Sourcing wood to burn in power stations like Drax is already devastating forests around the world, polluting communities, leading to biodiversity loss, and making the climate crisis worse. And if you add on the BECCS technology, you'll create an even bigger demand for wood. That would mean you would have to cut down more forests, or you would have to convert large areas of land, including agricultural land, to grow monoculture tree plantations that would then be cut down. So that would cause huge pressure on enough land to grow food. The third huge issue with BECCS is that it is not carbon negative because burning wood biomass is not carbon neutral. The companies don't have to officially account their carbon emissions from burning wood. But as we heard, Drax actually emitted 13 million tons of CO2 from its wood burning. And last year, over 500 scientists wrote to President Biden, Ursula von der Leyen, and other world leaders, urging them to end subsidies for burning wood because of the devastating climate impact. And this is a quote from their letter. As numerous studies have shown, this burning of wood will increase warming for decades to centuries. That is true even when the wood replaces coal, oil, or natural gas. The fourth huge problem with BECCS is that it will be incredibly expensive. The climate think tank Ember did some research into the costs of BECCS at Drax last year and estimated that it will cost around £31.7 billion in subsidies for BECCS at Drax. And Ember also concluded that Drax is very unlikely to be able to deliver negative emissions. This cost would mean about £500 per person in the UK just to pay for BECCS at Drax, adding to our energy bill costs. And there's a huge danger that Drax will get these BECCS subsidies by claiming that it is carbon capture ready without actually having to capture and store any of its emissions, and it will carry on business as usual, burning even more wood and destroying forests. That's the bad news, but the good news is that we have alternatives. We don't need to rely on these dangerous techno fixes like BECCS, which would prevent meaningful climate action and make us miss our climate tactics. And the best news is that we already have the world's greatest carbon capture and storage technology, and they're called trees. And if we protect and restore our existing forests and allow them to grow, that's one of the best methods we have to actually keep our global temperature rises to 1.5 degrees or even below 2 degrees. The second key thing that we can do is to stop the subsidies for these dangerous false solutions. Biofuel Watch is part of a campaign called Cut Carbon Not Forests, and we're asking the UK government to transfer over £1 billion in UK renewable subsidies away from tree burning towards genuine renewable energy like wind and solar power. That would have huge benefits, not just by protecting wildlife, stopping polluting communities, protecting the climate, but it would also help to create green jobs in genuinely renewable energy. The other key thing we have to do, as well as stopping the existing subsidies, is to prevent the government wasting vast new subsidies on this false solution, and instead use those subsidies to help fund a just transition to genuinely green jobs. And it's been wonderful to see the Climate Jobs report and to read all about the potential for a just transition. And the New Economics Foundation has also been doing some really exciting research into the potential for a just transition in the Yorkshire area, away from these carbon intensive industries. We really can go beyond burning. And I'd just like to finish with a quote from a paper called The Biomass Delusion, which has been signed by 170 environmental groups from around the world, that we can really focus on genuine carbon capture by protecting our forests. Protecting and restoring the world's forests is a climate change solution. Burning them is not. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Sally. Thank you very much for that. And I wonder if you might be willing to share your slides so we could also include them alongside a recording and Simon's slides, but let us know if that's doable. Yeah, really appreciate that, Sally. There are a good number of questions in the chat.